questions, so you're okay. We're live. We're back. The gang is back. The gang is back. It is October, almost November. I mean, that's quite scary, really. Where's this year gone? How are we, guys? How are we?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Laura. Good.
Mark's just rushed in, so we're all sitting comfortably and ready to talk about vulnerability. It's caused quite a lot of conversation online. This particular "Are You Truly Living?" I'm going to start with a quote from Brené Brown because I think it will set the scene quite nicely about what vulnerability is. And then I'm going to throw it to you guys because there's been a couple of questions in the chat from the post that we've done that I'm going to pick up on and I'm going to get your take on it. But in her book, Daring Greatly, Brené Brown talks about vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Now, I know, Dan, you said, and it was a chicken and egg question.
Yeah.
You said for you, vulnerability was about self-awareness and courage.
Yes.
And I challenged you, but which one comes first?
Yeah, and that's a really tough question, and it's taken me all day. And when I talk about the answer to this, I am prepared to be wrong here, right? I am prepared to be wrong. Yeah. I don't claim to have all the answers. So I think awareness has to come first. I think that's got to be where it starts, and it's the smallest little kernel of awareness. It's not some full flash epiphany how this starts. It's a feeling. It's something not right. It's uneasiness, constant uneasiness, perhaps. That's a clue. That's your sign that something's up. Something's out of alignment. You're not being who you are. And I guess that's what vulnerability is all about, right? It's about having the courage to fully face yourself and accept everything about yourself and who you are, and then present that to the world. And that's, I think, one of the things I've missed in my content about it this week, and some of the comments I've read, is what I've not explained or not said is vulnerability is really, really, really tough. It takes incredible courage, and we've got courage in the title today. Incredible. It takes real backbone. You've got to face your deepest, darkest secrets, because to be vulnerable and to share yourself with the world, you talk about this, Laura, you've got to be anchored completely in who you are, because this takes serious balls to face this stuff and then to be able to share it with the world too. And we kind of get taught, and I certainly know as a man I did, and I think for women it's a slightly different message, but it's equally as toxic, is about burying things like guilt and shame and regret, and holding on to things like bitterness and it shouldn't have happened to me. And when you do that, your mind then creates these protection mechanisms, these walls that you build. And that is the cause of the feeling of out of whack, is the walls you put up to the world that you think you need to protect you. And the fact you've let your ego now jump in the driving seat to try and keep you safe. That's where you'll get that uneasiness. And vulnerability starts, you see, vulnerability is what is going to repair you in order to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right. So it starts with yourself. It starts being prepared to admit some stuff to yourself. And it's not easy. It's a really tough thing to do. And what really worked for me was going for some low hanging fruit. That's what started the ball rolling for me, being able to be vulnerable, was looking at some things I'd held on to emotionally in my life, and with a new perspective, with an expanded awareness, with a bit more life experience and maturity, and just realizing this whole story I'd built about how this thing shouldn't have happened, how bitter I was just total rubbish, and in fact quite laughable. And I could drop it and then share it with somebody. Brilliant. And the minute you do that, you feel lighter. And when you feel lighter, you can then summon more courage in order to be more vulnerable. And it's steps. It's incremental.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is steps. I'm going to challenge Mark now. So, what I don't know. I suppose let's because Dan and I'd had the dialogue in the conversation on a post about this. Is it self-awareness? Is it courage? That was Dan's interpretation of vulnerability. What does vulnerability mean to you, Mark? And being vulnerable.
Yeah, like it's an interesting question. It was something you said, Laura. I was giving a talk today, and on well-being, and it was just a group of men. So it was about 30, I think it was about 35 men in the room. And I decided I'd bring in vulnerability into the talk. I couldn't announce that I was going to talk about vulnerability. I just brought it in as I was talking about it. And I realized, and it was in my post today, I realized that the word itself, vulnerability, it puts people off. You say you need to be vulnerable. Everyone goes, what does that mean? What does it mean I need to be vulnerable? Like, how do I need to be vulnerable? Do I need to walk outside naked? Okay, let's not do that, right? That's certainly vulnerable, but that's not the space we want to go into,
Oh, Mark, I wish you'd told me that earlier.
Well, okay. Well, I was gonna finish this. Are you truly living in a very dramatic way? But we won't go that way maybe today, maybe because it's cold, right? But right. So, and even in what I'm saying there, right, is a huge thing on vulnerability, right? Because that sense of ourself, there's that vulnerability in who we are, right? And you said about it showing up, and you use that in that quote, Laura, right? When I was giving my TEDx talk, because I used too many words, I had freaking an hour written for a talk, right? And I was editing it down. And there was one part I was trying to keep in and I couldn't keep it in, but I wanted it for how visual it was from a vulnerability perspective, right? And it was kind of where that I had this impression where I was going to stand on stage as if I was a boxer, and here I am, I'm defending us, I'm here, I'm defending the ego and go, no, I am better than that. No, if you've run a marathon, I've run 2 marathons, this kind of stuff that we say to ourselves all the time. And my imagery was what I wanted to do. I wanted to give the impression that suddenly it's putting my arm on my shoulder, the real me, the authentic, putting my shoulder and saying, you know what? It's okay. I can do this. I can do this. I can step forward. You don't need to keep defending me. And I think that's a big part of that journey, is to step forward because the ego we build is there to keep us safe. But the ego is there to avoid any vulnerability whatsoever. It's to make sure we don't feel vulnerable. It's actually into that shame cycle that it's trying to defend us from. And it's up to us to step through being who we really are in the world. And of course, that takes courage. Because you said it beautifully down in another post, accepting the feminine side of yourself. It was, I can't remember whose post it was. It was Laura Tomlinson's about the men and female together, right? And about that accepting the feminine side of ourselves. Because as men in particular, oh Jesus, no, what? There's nothing feminine about me. We spend our life doing this, only to then realize there is, and the fact that we're ignoring it is a bigger problem, But it takes that vulnerability to accept and move into that space.
I agree with you. I think so my challenge comes then in the same way to Dan. Which comes first, the self-awareness or the courage, or courage and self-awareness?
Yeah, so it's definitely self-awareness first, that something isn't right, and then after that, then it's the courage to do something about it. And what it is all about, and the word I really like from Brené Brown's quote, and I've quoted her this week in my content too, is seen. And that's what it's about. It's about being seen. It's about being vulnerable enough to be seen. Because if we're going to evolve and grow as people, we need deep connections and excellent relationships. None of us is an island. This lone wolf business is a myth. Humans are social creatures. We're tribal animals, and in order to be part of a tribe, we need to be vulnerable. We need to share. We need to be seen, and that starts with knowing yourself. So that's self-awareness. But in order to explore some of the deep and dark places of yourself, to get yourself in that, I seem to have said self a lot, on that foundation of knowing who you are, what you care about, why you care about it, what you believe in. So then you can outwardly share that with the world and stand up for it, and be seen. And because standing up for what you believe in, especially in this day and age, is really difficult because everything's so divisive and so black and white, and there is a lot of nastiness around, and you can get shot down if you put yourself out there. It's happened to me a few times because I make a lot of content, and some of it does okay and gets people I don't know looking at it, and so I get some trolling and some hate sometimes, and mainly I can just let that go over my head. But so you've got to have the courage to do that. But then I can do that because I've spent a lot of time understanding who I am, what I really value. I'm really grounded in that now. It's taken a lot of work. It's taken a lot of facing some of the stuff I've done and said that I'm not proud of. It's taken a lot of forgiveness on myself, on other people. You have to look at your emotional scars and your baggage and what you're carrying around with you. And the guilt and the shame, they're two horrendous emotions. And every single one of us carries this around at some point with us in our lives. Mine came from my Roman Catholic upbringing, where we were bred to hate ourselves and carried guilt and shame like a badge of honor. And I had to look at that and process that stuff and face it. And it was hard. It really was hard. It took a lot of courage, and it was incremental. I had to, I'd have been overwhelmed if I'd have looked at too much of it at once. You've got to do this step by step by step by step. And each level is another level of awareness, actually, and another level of courage. So those two things you mentioned, Laura, it starts with awareness, you get a bit more courage, and then each stage you do, and then you start being able to share with more people, starting with those really close to you and those that you trust. And then just being able to put a bit more of yourself out there, and then realizing, telling the ego and stopping it kicking in and jumping in the driving seat, we're safe here. It's cool. Yeah. Nothing to be afraid of in sharing parts of ourselves. And when you do it, what you'll find is lots of people saying to you, oh, yeah, that's me too. Yeah, you've made me feel really seen and heard there too. And that's the power of it, vulnerability. And that's how you form deep and lasting relationships. And if you can't be vulnerable, you can't form deep and lasting relationships.
No, I'm going to bring it. Joanna's written a comment here. She says, my challenge is that you're associating vulnerability with feminism. Isn't that perpetuating bias?
Are we?
I'm going to throw that one too. That's the question that's being asked.
I would have said that we're associating the lack of vulnerability with toxic masculinity as opposed to with feminism. I know I get her point. Like when I was saying, like, we have this feminine side. I suppose on the male perspective. Okay, I'll give a story. Right, that I was listening to a podcast. I think the guy's name was, and I'll look it up because it was so good. It was Greg Harden. Okay, he passed away recently, and he was talking about he's a coach who worked with a lot of sports stars in big spaces, and he was talking about how he went out to his father one day, and his father was working on his car, and he said to his dad, do you need help? And his father turned and looked at him and said, I never need help. And his father said to him, if you saw me out here fighting a bear, go help the bear, because I will never ask for help. And he said he internalized this way of thinking, and he internalized it completely to the point where he would never ask for help even when he needed it. So he had internalized that I have to make sure I am never vulnerable. Therefore, I cannot ask for help. And I think, look, in fairness, Joanna, it's probably a good point that maybe we are saying that we're feminizing that thing. But it's much more about being ourselves and being all parts of ourselves in order to push through it, right? And if I can, there's a quote that I came across today. It was from David White, and it was about shame, because the resistance to vulnerability is the shame cycle. It's an amazing line he wrote. He said, shame is the inverse measure of our ability to incarnate fully into our bodies and the vast, overwhelming, and astonishing tidal body of the world. That's a lot in that quote, right? So shame is the inverse measure of our ability to incarnate fully into our bodies and the vast, overwhelming, and astonishing tidal body of the world. And you could spend a lifetime on that. And I think it's really powerful how it's a cycle for us. And when we find ourselves in that shame space, we are deliberately avoiding being vulnerable when we're in that shame space. We're trying to avoid that concept of shame. Like, I know I could spend half an hour giving examples from my life, like from growing up, from being a teenager, from, feeling shame about stuff and what I created to avoid that, and the danger that caused me. Like, and I think both of you can probably do similar things.
Mm. No, I think, and Joanna's just said she meant femininity rather than feminism, which makes sense. And I guess this is something that we've had a conversation. I mean, we were talking about it earlier this week in a call offline, online but offline, if that makes sense. And I was challenging, and I know, Dan, I've challenged you over, is that just male thinking? Because actually, I still think, I have shame, all the rest of it, and actually, is it more about, back to your point, Mark, about actually we're embracing all of ourselves, whatever that is,
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily call it my feminine part or my masculine part. I'd just say it's part of me that I am not necessarily embracing. So I am not showing up fully as myself. And I think, Dan, you kind of talk about, I keep saying self, but it has to start with self, because unless we're grounded in ourselves, then actually we can't be vulnerable, because if we don't know who we are, what matters most to us, where's the grounding? It's actually everybody else's perception of us. And I think it plays into, and this especially plays into a comment that somebody was making, and I think this is one of the things that I want to pick up, there's an element about when this vulnerability, when you feel quite, I'm not going to say, I don't know, I am going to say quite comfortable with yourself. And I think
that's a good way of describing it, isn't it?
Well, I think the thing is when, so if and it was, somebody made a comment about this, and I think there's vulnerability when I know who I am and how I want to show up, because I have a level of awareness, and as you say, it takes courage to make steps. But then I think back to where I was 10 years ago, and I mean, strict raw was probably how I would describe it, because I no longer had any sense of self. I was not the same person I had been, but 2 months previously, when my husband was still alive, I was still in a career that I was doing incredibly well in, and I knew exactly where I was. And then not only, so I would have said that I felt like I was, happy to show up as myself and be vulnerable. And then I was catapulted into a whole world where vulnerability overload. And I think there's a difference between when you are consciously making a choice about how you want to show up because that's you, and then there is a vulnerability that is because circumstances beyond your control and influence have left you questioning everything, and there is a vulnerability on that. And to the point that Mark made about the actual word many people don't like, and I talk openly that I don't like the word vulnerability, probably because in my world I've had too much of I've had everything taken away, and therefore I know what that's like to not know who one itself is and have to rebuild that. And I suppose because that's the story I have, I've had to work out what the new person is, to reground myself, to show up in the way that you find me today. But that's been a huge journey that has been way more than just little steps of courage. I mean, some of that has been, I've been flung outside the comfort zone. There isn't a comfort zone, and actually trying to find something that actually gives that stability is back to, okay, well, who am I then? What matters now as opposed to what mattered 10 years ago?
Yeah, and of course, life has thrown us all into vulnerable places, and we end up having to, we become vulnerable because we're made of matter, and we are physical things, and we're fragile, and things can happen to destroy parts of us or break parts of us or test parts of us. And you're right, the more we are grounded in that foundation of knowing who we are, and the more we've been vulnerable just with ourselves. And what I mean by that is honesty. That's what it's about. It's about being authentic and being honest with you, and that starts with you. It starts at home. And yeah, it's about acknowledging and accepting parts of yourself, so that when the winds of change do come, and when, you know, and by winds of change for some of us, it's going to be a hurricane, and life has a habit of chucking things all at once. So 3 or 4 major life changes and horrific losses and things like that get chucked to you all at once. You're going to be vulnerable. That's inevitable in life. You know, you're going to lose people really close to you. We all are. So yeah, the more you can work that awareness and that courage muscle, the stronger you'll be when that happens to you. And you know, that's everyday work. And you know, Joanna's point is great, because that thinking that vulnerability is feminine is what would put a lot of men off doing it, and maybe even women too, right? And we've got to be careful with these labels. They're really useful. It's really useful to talk about masculinity and femininity. I talk about masculinity an awful lot, but sometimes you have to divorce masculine and feminine energies from gender. And you know, yeah, you definitely could say that being vulnerability in the way we're talking about, and being seen and being kind to yourself in order that you can share with the world, you could call that a feminine quality. It probably is, but actually it doesn't matter gender wise. We all have masculine and feminine qualities. We're all a bit of both. You know, it's the yin and the yang. That's the balance of being a human being. And yeah, it's you know, for all of us to accept all those parts of us, and however we want to describe them, and whatever we want to label them as, and whatever we want to call them, and that's unique to everybody, and we're all welcome to do that. But the important thing is just knowing what that means to you, and what it means for you and your relationships, and how you show up for the people you really care about. And being prepared, Laura, as you say, for the time where life is going to make you vulnerable.
No, I think it's having those tools that we can readily, you know, access in those times when, you know, we're thrown into, as I often say, you know, a world that we no longer recognise the terrain. we have no map for, and possibly didn't even ask for either. You know, and what's the only constant? Ourselves. And so, you know, that's the only constant from the moment we're born to the moment we die. You know, we have to get comfortable with ourselves, and we have to start drawing on the tools to be able to respond in those moments. And so I guess, you know, question for you, Mark, how can we become more vulnerable?
I've had a few conversations with people who talked about the risk of vulnerability. And I think we have to be very fair, because look at the online world, look at social media, right? I share a lot of stuff that's quite personal, okay? And I've learned how to share that. Okay, I'll go back. When I first started doing what I'm doing, I would meet and be speaking to friends. I wouldn't even tell them what I was doing. I'd just say, "Oh, how's work? Grand." I wouldn't tell them that I was doing this, that I had been made unemployed in a job. That was very vulnerable. That was a challenge. I wouldn't tell them what I was doing, because it was vulnerable to tell them I was putting myself out into the world and doing this, right? But there's a lot of stuff I don't share, because that's too much, and it's not safe for me to share that. It's not safe for maybe me to put it out in the world. It's not safe because it involves other people. It's not safe because I don't feel safe in that space. So I think a huge part of our approaching vulnerability is, and it still takes the strength and courage to do it, but we have to feel that we're safe. Now, sometimes we might even need to do it when we're not feeling safe, and we might need to be very, very brave. But there's a danger in being vulnerable in spaces where it's not safe to be vulnerable. And I'll give you an example. I think maybe I mentioned this before. I put a post up a few weeks ago about a WhatsApp group, a men's WhatsApp group. I think we did talk about this the last time. And the guy who put a message in saying that that he was struggling, that he was suicidal, you know. And it took some amount of courage for him to put that up there. Huge amount of courage and bravery. And that allowed everyone else to be vulnerable because he did that. And allowed everyone else to share stories because he did that. Yeah. Because he created a safe space through doing that, because it was a safe space. But how many people out there, and maybe this is one of the important parts, you do say, how could you be vulnerable? How many people out there have a safe space to be vulnerable, have a safe space to explore that, have a safe space to put themselves out there into the world, you know. Like, you know, I know I've worked with people and they'll be given, oh, look at Pride Week. Oh, it's bloody Pride Week again. Why do they have to have this? Where's the straight week? Right? This kind of stuff, right? You know, and you know, I always have this conversation and go, well, have you had to announce your sexuality that's different to everyone else and get vilified for doing it? You know, Pride Week is a safe space for someone there to express themselves in a way that they need to express themselves and be seen and be heard and be vulnerable, because we're trying to create safety for that. So it's a huge part of the ability to be vulnerable. It's where we can feel safe. So if someone is struggling with vulnerability, what is the smallest step you can make where you still have safety, you still have security, you're still okay? Because I think that's where we can begin.
No, and I'm with you. I think that's the thing. And sometimes it takes someone to almost, I don't know, I'm going to say the role model. I know it's not necessarily the right word, but to step out and I guess lift their head above the parapet and say, okay, I'm you know, I'm going to be a little bit braver to set a precedent so that everybody else, like the example that you're giving of the guy who said, you know, into the WhatsApp group that he was suicidal. You know, it took him to kind of perhaps a little bit out beyond the boundaries he would normally do, so that others could know what they could share. Sometimes it takes another to take that step for others to know how safe that space is. And that's really hard when people are so quick to judge. You know, I mean, when we were talking about sort of the courage stroke self-awareness thing, it reminded me of the Harriet Lerner quote about courage from her book, The Dance of Fear. And in that, she says, you know, courage goes into hiding when we learn that, you know, it's not safe to show up as ourselves. And, you know, I mean, that's much abbreviated, but, and that's true. It's like, you know, it's almost like getting your fingers burnt and you learn that it's and we don't reassess that at any point. That's almost learned, and we go, oh no, if I do that again, I'm always going to have the same outcome, and we don't reassess that. And so I think part of being, how do we become more vulnerable, is saying, okay, well, it might not necessarily have worked in that environment, but I just chose the wrong environment. It doesn't mean that that space is going to have exactly the same outcome because the space is different, but it's being aware of that. So it comes back to that thing around, you know, the awareness that we get, because we're not going to get it right every time. But if we shrink more into ourselves, we lose the opportunity to have deep, authentic connections. And we know that, you know, I mean, there's enough research out there that says, you know, when we build authentic connections, trust, loyalty within team environments, within relationships, is just built. You know, it just goes from strength to strength to strength. But when we don't have that, then that's when there starts to be this, well, what's really going on? I can't show up as myself. There's a risk to me if I do. And that in itself breeds fear. And it's, you know, it's hard. And Joanna's saying, yeah, I agree. Going first paves the way for others. Yes, totally.
Yeah. Leaders. That's what we need right now. That's what we need in order to be vulnerable, is someone to lead the way, someone to take the first step. And, you know, role models, people who are prepared to do it. And, you know, one of the things that often frustrates me about us human beings is we're all sat around waiting to be led. We're waiting for some other sod to get up and say, right, this is the way, here we go, watch me.
Totally.
And so, you know, I created a WhatsApp group. I ummed and ahed about things. I you know, I need places, safe places where I can be vulnerable and talk about things that are going on for me. So I created a WhatsApp group, and it's brilliant, and it's for blokes, and it's a place where we share and we support each other, and there's no judgment. And judgment was a word you used just now, Laura. And this is key, right? Yeah. So when it comes to judgment, what can we all do about judgment? We can stop judging. That's all we can control. We can't moan about other people doing it. We can't point fingers. It's very unhelpful. But what can we do about it? We can stop judging. We can stop judging ourselves, and we can stop judging other people. It's really not a useful thing to do. And it stops you being vulnerable, and it stops other people being vulnerable. So it stops those deep connections and those amazing collaborations, as you're saying, Laura, there. That's when humans thrive, when we're deeply connected like that. You know, we've all been in places and worked in places and been part of teams where you feel like there's a hive mind going on, and you are safe to be vulnerable. And it's beautiful when that happens. And then something else we've all touched on, I think, and I want to reiterate, is the appropriateness of it. You've got to have the self-awareness for a kickoff, and then also a bit of awareness of reading a room and the context of where you are and what's going on. So just to be a bit vulnerable myself for a second, when I first discovered vulnerability, I got really carried away. It felt like a superpower to me. So I went, as I do with everything I turn my attention to, I went 2 feet first, jumped off the cliff. Whoa, and it's great. I'm a little bit of an oversharer. And I was being vulnerable, and it wasn't massively appropriate to be vulnerable. And you know, and I've let my white savior complex show on a couple of occasions and things like that, and said things where the whole room has gone quiet and there's been a tumbleweed moment, and I've just gone, that's not overly appropriate, is it? You've overshared again then, mate. And I've learned from that, and it's cool, but I just want to put that out there.
But I think that's it though, isn't it, Dan? It's like sometimes we have to
make mistakes, though. Be prepared.
No, absolutely. And you know, because how do we know how far that boundary is unless we actually, you know, dip our toes in the water? You know, I mean, it's, you know, with the stuff that I'm doing with the police over the last year. I mean, a year ago I knew nothing, and even today I had a call this afternoon, and I just said, look, you know, I'm going to be really honest. Some of my conversations have been, I'm going to use the word car crashy, but kind of clumsy, because it's so confusing. Even within certain aspects, people don't really know fully who does what. So how can I, as Mrs. You know, effectively Joe Public, trying to understand it in order to make it work better? I think for me, we have to, you know, sometimes my vulnerability was, because I have this narrative that of something that my dad said to me years ago, was about the fact that I over communicate, and I'll use 10 words when one will do. Laura Longletter, as my nickname is well cited. But so I have that narrative that goes on in my head, and that because I think and speak often at the same time, I know that sometimes people are looking at me like going, I have no idea where your curly whirly brain is going. And so I'm kind of really conscious of that, but I laugh about it because actually it instantly put this guy who I was in conversation with this afternoon, because he was new, it turned out he was new into the role. They're trying to work out how did they get their role, and had I not stepped into that space going, look, I picked up on our conversation on said date the other day, and I just wanted to follow that through and just go with it. We had an amazing call, taken away loads of action just because I stepped into the space and went, look, my curly whirly brain is, you know, slightly clumsy conversation, but did we get actions out of it? Absolutely, because we had a meeting of minds, because I've perhaps been vulnerable in that space, and which gave him the signal that he too could be vulnerable back. And the outcome from that was, you know, a joint commitment to the projects that he wants to do and that I want to do. I mean, that's got to be success, no?
Yeah,
you know,
sounds like it.
So, I mean, obviously I've got to now deliver across all of this.
Yeah, what you did there, Laura, is you led, you see, and there are times where, as an extrovert, somebody does need to do the talking. Somebody does need to fill the silence. Somebody does need to take the first step. And I find myself doing that quite a lot. I'm always prepared to open my gob. And then it's finding that balance of when the right time is and when the wrong time is. And I think sometimes people are really pleased. I've been on tons of workshops that I've gone to and seminars, and I'll always put my hand up and go, I'll do it. And afterwards people come to me and say, Dan, thanks for doing that, mate. Thanks for stepping in like that. And I'm able to do that because I'm really aware of myself. And the more I test that out, the more I know when it's appropriate to pick the baton up and lead, and what I can and can't share about myself. Because, if it's all well and good talking about vulnerability, but we're all a work in progress. And until we've looked at bits of our lives and really accepted them and shared them with those close to us, then you can probably share them with the world, right? Don't go sharing shit to the world before the people close to you have been led, because you're going to get yourself in a world of trouble.
I think Joanna makes a really good point. When she said, I don't know whether you've seen it, but she says, and whilst we're working on stopping judgment, we can stop acting from that place of judgment, which I think is absolutely spot on. Too often we're so quick to say, this is how it is, and actually we've judged before we
need to be prepared to be wrong, don't we?
Well, that's a huge part of vulnerability, is being prepared to be wrong, or is accepting when we are wrong, accepting that we can be wrong, accepting that we will be wrong. You've touched a lot on the self-awareness piece, and your story there, Laura, about how you're working and how your brain works, was a lot of self-compassion in that story, despite the fact that it was with somebody else point to you, you've accepted that about yourself and you've understood that about yourself. And I believe as a formula, self-awareness plus self-compassion, well, self-awareness and self-acceptance plus self-compassion equals self-worth. That's when we give ourselves our value, and that's a space we can stand tall from. And that's what we're always building a little bit in that vulnerability space. We're building more and more of our own self-worth. The more of ourself we can put out there and be comfortable with, because once we are able to own that story, then it's ours. And then if we own our flaws, nobody can use our flaws against us. But when we won't own our flaws, then we can be attacked all the time on those flaws. Like there's a famous political leader with ginger hair, or kind of orange hair at the moment, who I won't name, but it's a man who cannot own his flaws. You can see it in him. He cannot own his flaws. And I know I have flaws I still don't own. I can live with a wife and a couple of kids here, and the daughter, they'll always be badgering me on different things. And when I see my back up, I'm going, okay, they got me on that one, right? So what are they getting me on? They've got me there, because I'm not owning those particular flaws. That's it. Once we take that, and there's a vulnerability in that, and accepting, because probably in our head, we all have this perfect vision of ourselves in a certain way, right? But we struggle to match the truth of the imperfect version of ourselves with the perfect vision that we would like to have. And in that space between is who we really are. And once we step into that with that self-compassion idea, there's our self-worth. And that can't be touched.
And that's life's journey, isn't it, Mark? That's what it's all about. He's constant. You're never going to get there, but it's bridging that gap between the imperfect you and the perfect vision you have. But perfection, it's an illusion, right? So we're never going to get there. But as long as you know that and you're aware, you can keep striving for it, always striving to be growing and striving to be better. And Joanna's absolutely right. We can't do that if you're acting from a place of judgment. So you've got to be prepared to be wrong, prepared to look messy, prepared to look a bit silly, and because all of those things are okay, And the trouble is, when we feel vulnerable, we can kick in those ancient parts of our physiology and in our nervous system, and fight or flight can happen, and that leaves us reacting instead of responding. And it means we can't use our frontal cortex because the blood goes to our muscles so we can run away or have a fight. And if we're coming from a place of judgment, we're going to be stressed, and it's going to kick that system in, and we literally can't think straight then. So you've just got to. It's all an awareness game, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. No, it is, and I think Joanna's saying spot on. We owning our flaws. Absolutely, none of us. We're all perfectly imperfect. And therefore, once we've acknowledged and accepted that, you know, Laura Longletter is gonna live on. She's gonna have her curly whirly moments. But, you know, I accept that that's how my brain works, and there's no point in sitting there going, "Oh, I should have done this. I could have done that," because how, you know, that's just sitting in judgment of myself, and how is that going to enable me to keep moving forward? So I guess, you know, because I'm conscious of, you know, time and people want to go and have their dinners, and Mark's running off to his next event. So I guess, you know, vulnerability, we said, is self-awareness and courage. And, you know, it's kind of a mixture of the two, and it starts with self-awareness. Is it really just about being true to ourselves?
Well, I think a lot of it is, but I think as we build it, like, to be good at vulnerability is to be resilient to shame, because it's that shame piece and that shame cycle where we're afraid, like, and we don't want to experience that. Every one of us, and I know I harked back to it earlier, but we felt shame when we were younger. A lot of this stuff we build up when we're 10 and 12, young, and even teenage years, and we did stuff that if we think about it now, still feel the pain of it a little bit. And if we're still feeling the pain of it a little bit, well, then we're not resilient to the shame of that. You know, we haven't owned it yet. And an awful lot of that is what we're trying to fight. Like, so, you know, building the resilience to the shame part of it. And, you know, we mentioned earlier about someone stepping up and stepping forward, because that's where you're risking the judgment. That's where you're risking people's judgment making you feel ashamed and taking that part onto yourself. But if we're resistant to that shame, well, you know what? I'm not going to own that, because that's not part of what I need anymore. That's not part of what I want. Maybe that's part of what I used to own. And hence, as I said at the very start, but, you know, so, you know, maybe you finish this by getting naked and walking out of the room, right? You know, but I wouldn't be resistant to that shame. I wouldn't be resistant to it. I would struggle. I would be resilient for that shame. I would struggle in that space, right? It's a human body. Everyone has one, you know, like, what's that about, right? But then I would be inviting all the judgment in my head from everyone else because of doing something of that nature, you know? Yeah. And just, there you go. There's a real life example of it. And there's an extreme example of it too, you know? But still how we are, and part of how we still have all this stuff to conquer to keep moving on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, it's that time again. But yeah.
Okay.
Off you go then, Mark. You know, you might be on your own on that one. We will be seeing everybody next month, 21st of November, and we are going to be talking about creating unshakable self-belief. So exactly.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah.
Fab. Well, look, have a fab evening, everyone, and look forward to catching up soon. Bye.
Bye.